Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is fruit, and I have a whole bunch of fruit trees behind me there. And this is called a chocolate pudding fruit, also known as a black sapote. Most of you have never heard of this fruit or many of the fruit trees I have in the back there because they're tropical fruits here in South Florida. I live in South Florida and I grow tropical fruits. Now, I eat a raw vegan diet. I only eat raw food that's not no animals, and my diet basically consists of my garden here has a whole bunch of leafy greens that I'm growing. I do eat nuts and seeds, and I eat fruit. So a question comes up often is fruit healthy? Because there's a lot of sugar in fruit, especially fruit that's picked off the tree ripe and tropical fruits, like there's a bunch of different mangoes back there and so on. Is fruit healthy, or should we be consuming fruit? Especially if somebody has diabetes or cancer, should we be consuming fruit? Well, I have my opinions about it, but there are many other people that have opinions about it too. But the reason why I'm doing this video today is recently I was doing an interview with Dr. Fred Bishey and Sam Shepard about Velasta astaxanthin. And Sam Shepard, who's the owner of the astaxanthin company, which is an amazing product, I highly recommend it, suggested that people not eat fruit because the fructose is, as he called it, poison to the body. Now, Dr. Bishey has been on a raw vegan diet for over 50 years, 100% raw vegan, and an excellent health, and he eats fruit. So after Sam Shepard gave his opinion about it, about fructose, Fred Bishey gave his opinion about it, and then I chimed in and gave my opinion about it. So I'm going to show you that clip, and then I'm going to come back here and talk about a couple of other things on this topic. So here's the clip now. Okay, the next question is, can a high fruit diet be okay with Velasta, as fruits are high in sugar, even though natural? And I think they're two separate subjects. I don't know if a fruit diet versus I don't think the Velasta makes a difference. I think it's a separate question, but
it is. When I see somebody in a disease state, I ask them to cut out fructose. Fructose is a poison. It's not metabolized. It's the primary cause of LDL cholesterol. It's not something that we can use. Glucose, even though it's high glycemic, is still the sugar molecule that's used. The real key is you can eat as much fruit as you want and as much fructose as you want, as long as you keep your C-reactive protein less than 3. If you see your C-reactive protein creeping up, putting you into an oxidative state, or if you've got fatty liver disease, cut the fructose out. No sugar. Sugar is 50% glucose, 50% fructose. I even tell people to cut the fruit out. Orange juice is notorious until you get this under control. Everything has to be in balance. And we desire fruit because of the sweetness. The apples that we eat today, and I got into this with some Messianic folks up in Oregon, where I had mentioned that you should cut fruit out of your diet. And they said, wait, the Genesis diet states that we should eat fruit. And my point was, do you think that the apple you're eating today is the same apple that Adam and Eve ate back then? It's not. They've been hybridized to increase the fructose content so that you eat more of their apples. It's economics. What desire do we have? We have a desire for sweetness. All sweetness comes from fructose. Glucose is only 70% as sweet as fructose. So we put high fructose corn syrup in our diet since 1966. Up until 1966, our cancer rate was 1 death in 50. After 1966, it's now 1 in 3. So what happened in 1966? Lyndon Johnson approved high fructose corn syrup to be added into our food supply because he was cutting off the corn subsidy to fight the Vietnam War. They poisoned our food system. And as a result, apple growers, strawberry growers, orange growers, their primary objective is to pick those fruits that generate the highest level of fructose to meet the human desire for sweetness. Because if it's sweet, you'll eat a lot more of their product.
Fred, do you have a comment on that, Fred?
Yeah, my take on that is a little bit different, to be honest with you, Sam. I found that when I went on a raw diet, I was trying to, run competitively in marathons, and I found the only way on the vegan diet, the only way you can get enough calories is by eating fruit or complex sugars that are in starches. I think when the high fructose corn syrup that's used in studies, of course, that's a rank poison. But when you're eating a piece of fruit today, and there's different types of fruits that are organically grown, the sugars there, the amount of sugar that's in a piece of fruit that has all the vitamins and some minerals and the digestible cellulose, you actually need it. I eat fruit. If I didn't eat enough fruit, I would not be energetic. And my my CRP is always, it's very, very, very low. So
That works
and
for
your
you.
brain can only burn glucose, primarily utilize glucose as fuel. That's one of the problems of now they're having with the ketogenic diet. People can't last, ketones are actually a backup system. It's not, people don't last on a ketogenic diet. I've had numerous people call me that are having problems. I agree with you about the high fructose corn syrup. That's a rank poison. But if a physically active person it's eating a vegan diet, or especially eating a raw diet where you can't eat cooked starches, you got to eat some fruit. I'm not saying you should binge on fruit. Whatever you need, it's like putting gas in your car. Otherwise, you're going to get very, very thin. You'll be emaciated. You just won't look good. But that's one of the keys.
That's
the good thing about a raw diet, because if it's a calorie restricted way of eating, your arteries empty out. It really, and I've had plenty of people that actually had cancer eat a moderate amount of fruit, and they did very, very well. So I understand what you're saying, but we have to separate the difference between high fructose corn syrup and the fructose that's found in fruit. So it's a little bit different, you know what I mean? And a lot of the research was done with high fructose corn syrup, which I'm totally against. I'm against people doing that. I understand what you're saying, but I think when you eat, it's perfectly safe to leave out the fruit and eat vegetables. And if you're eating cooked food, you can eat starches, which are complex sugars. But no matter if you're eating animal protein, you're eating fat, and you're not eating a high protein diet without, on a carbohydrate restricted diet. I mean, your body is actually converting everything else into glucose, so your brain can utilize the glucose, unless you're on a ketogenic diet. A lot of people on a ketogenic diet, they're not making it a fat-based diet. They're making it like the Atkins diet, which is a high-protein diet. And in the long run, that failed. I mean, it failed with Atkins. He was 50 pounds overweight, and he was a cardiologist. He died in the hospital with coronary artery disease. And a friend of mine was a doctor that was one of them, was taking care of him. So a lot of the information out there is kind of misleading,
Like I think, from my experience, my CRP is low, and I eat a diet with a good amount of fruit. I have a fruit farm here, but I eat a lot of greens that I feel balances it out. I eat a lot of greens. If I was eating a lot of bread and starches along with the fruit, I think that would cause things to not be good. But I don't eat a lot of starches. I just
cut
eat
out the McDonald's hamburgers.
Yeah,
That's the processed foods.
Paul, if I could interrupt you,
Sure.
You got a valid point there. I've seen people that were diabetics and were eating, a lot of food and eating processed food and eating a lot of processed sugars in there. And as soon as they add fruit into their diet, their blood sugar will spike. It'll go up. So, but if they eliminate the processed food and they start to eat a healthy diet, especially with a vegan diet, that's why I tell people if you want to eat some fruit and you're diabetic, I suggest that you change your diet where that fruit is going to be consumed into in the Krebs cycle, creating energy. So
Yeah,
I've got currently probably 20 to 30 children ages 9 to 16 that have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and it's all from sodas, sugar sodas.
It's all from what? From soda?
soda. He said
Yeah,
soda. Yeah.
sugar
I
sodas.
believe that 100%.
That's a can of
100%.
processed sugar. Yeah.
But it's
the processed sugar is probably the worst thing. Probably the worst thing out there, and
It is.
especially for anybody that's battling cancer. See, that's where a lot of confusion is. Anybody is battling cancer, if they want to help themselves dietarily, they got to give up the processed food and the processed sugar.
Yeah. I do want to say what Sam said about the orange juice. Now, this is a little bit different than fruit. I never recommend anyone drink straight up fruit juice. If you're having a green vegetable juice and you put an apple in there, that's one thing. But the sugars are so concentrated when you put it in juice form. So, like, for example, if anyone's going to drink orange juice, they should dilute it, half water, half orange juice. That'll slow it down, because the way it was designed in nature was the fiber and everything in the food is what would naturally do that. But when you put it in juice form, it's a little bit, so be careful with that, everybody. Okay, everybody, that was the clip. And as you see there, it's Sam Shepard's not the only one that thinks fructose is bad for the body. There are other people that believe so as well. As a matter of fact, there's one person who I follow for a long time. His name is Brian Clement. He's the first person at a place called Hippocrates Health Institute where I learned about eating healthy and learning about how to get healthy. And it's a raw vegan health spa, but they don't believe in serving fruit there, much fruit. Brian is also under the impression that fructose is bad for the body, especially for somebody with a existence disease or disease of cancer and diabetes and so on. So I'm going to put a clip by Brian here now of what he was saying. And there was something that piqued my interest, and it was really one of the main causes of this video, since I'm a fruit grower and I love to grow fruit and this topic. So here's what Brian had to say about fruit and fructose.
Saying that we were hunters and gatherers. So the new ones are doing science. They're doing work. And they're looking at the human teeth going back from the dawn of man. And they found out we were plant-based eaters. And by the way, one step further, we were hardly ever eating nuts, seeds, grains, and beans. We were just eating fruit as a main course and greens. That was it. And every once in a while, they'd see deeper indentations for a 5-10-year period. Dr. Lickey, as an example, did this work. And he got geologists wisely and said, why is that? And they said, that's when there was a drought. So the only time we didn't eat fresh, ripe fruit and greens were at the time there were droughts. Then we take the nuts, seeds, and beans. Now, with that said, why am I now going to tell you that we said back about 40 years ago, fruit's not a great thing when people are sick? And first it was with cancer. And within a year or two after that, we added it to virus, bacteria, mold, yeast, fungus, low blood sugar, and high blood sugar conditions. And we were sort of the lone wolf at that point. And how I did that is not because I saw science on it. I was observing people with visible tumors. So I would see women, for instance, with a tumor, and she would start drinking orange juice or carrot juice or beet juice, high fructose, or taking mangoes or whatever it may be. It would grow. Now, this was completely concerning to me because at that point, probably 50-60% of my diet was fruit. It's very easy to be a raw fooder on all fruit because I'm a flaming sugar addict just like you. I'm just recovering. And so the reality, quite simple, was I was frustrated. And I went on a 3-week rampage, frankly. I would sneak into medical libraries. I snuck into Harvard twice, NYU a couple of times, UCLA, a couple of my buddies brought me in. And we couldn't find anything in the medical literature. Matter of fact, I could hardly find fruits and vegetables were good for you. No less fruits were bad. And it happened to be, I finally got in touch and spoke to, and he was a gracious human being, an agricultural scientist, a PhD in agricultural science, the cultivation of fruit. And he said, well, here's the reason that's the problem. Because fruit today doesn't even vaguely resemble the original fruit. And to make this overly simple for you, not over heavy, I said, well, describe this in a way I can speak to the groups about this. He said, well, do you like crab apples? I said, no, they're horribly sour. He said, crab apple is more sweet than the original apple. So fruit today has 28, 30, 32, 33 times. My favorite apple hit 50 times more sugar. My favorite mango, of course, which was cultivated right here in West Palm Beach, a Hayden mango, that didn't even exist. The original mangoes actually taste more like turpentine. They had little to no sugar in them. And so that's the first thing. So we have this astronomical amount of sugar coming in. The real problem goes beyond that. That humans about 150 years ago, and even a little sooner than that, hardly ever ate processed sugar. Your family and my family highly unlikely ate processed sugar. We didn't have the money to. This was for the ultra elite, the kings, queens, princesses, etc. In one of my 30 books called Sweet Disease, I wrote about a study done at Princeton, which was mind-boggling. I read it 3 times before I got it through my head. They actually did something beautiful. They went on the street and found full-blast heroin addicts and cocaine addicts from Philadelphia. They did MRIs on their brain. Now, I didn't know this until I read this study, that when you're a cocaine addict, only part of your brain lights up. Heroin, another part of your brain lights up. Sugar addicts, all of us, the entire brain lights up. So from that, they realized that dozens of times more addictive than heroin and cocaine is sugar. And I can confirm that because even though I loved meat the day I gave it up 52 years ago, I gave it up in one day. All flesh products went away 3 years later. All dairy products went away. It took me 35 years to give up sugar. I'm out lecturing globally as a renowned research scientist and speaker, yet lying to people, saying don't eat sugar, walking out and eating 10 mangoes. I was lying. I was delusionary at that point. You get the same sugar from a mango that you get from white sugar. These are all from plants. Sugar doesn't come from anything but a plant. So it's what plant you choose to get your dope from. We found out that a person who's healthy could eat up to 15% of their diet by weight as ripe organic fruit. Now, where are you going to get ripe fruit? Your first problem. Organic, you can get that today. But you go to the health store, that's not ripe fruit. They cannot, will not, and by the way, if they want to stay in business, should not pick ripe fruit. Because if you pick ripe fruit in California and ship it to New York, by the time you open the box, it's rotten. So when you put an unripened fruit into your body, it robs the body of nutrients, minerals. For arthritics, they feel it immediately. Joint problems, they feel it immediately. Your teeth, it erodes. Any great dentist is going to tell you, ripe organic fruit will rot your teeth just as good as white sugar will. And dates are even the worst. Dried fruit sticking to me. So yes, a little bit of fruit is perfectly fine. I chose not to eat any. Fruit is not part of my diet for the last 4 or 5 years. I just watch what it does because it has secondary problems too. But it's a shame that we can take God's creation for the human diet and we can destroy it to such a level and destroy our human anatomy to such a level that something that is so perfect as a fruit is not so good for us today.
So I have a couple of questions for you on that and then on one other topic. So with the fruit, when you say 15% by weight for somebody that doesn't have these particular conditions or is considered healthy, give us more practical terms.
So let's imagine in a week, you're my age, and you don't eat 2 pounds a day. You eat 10 pounds of food a week. As you get older, your body starts to say, stupid, don't eat so much, you're going to live longer. That's why we all think, oh, we don't need as much food. No, the body's saying, hey, we're getting closer to death, stop eating so much. Because what we know is low caloric intake, high nutrition is how everyone lives long. So with that said, if I'm eating 10 pounds a week, that means I could eat 1.5 pounds of fruit that entire week, of ripe organic fruit. If I'm eating 20 pounds, when I was 20, I needed 20 pounds of food. Why? I'm growing, everything's developing, my energy is like this. What you can eat? You can eat 3 pounds of fruit a week. Now, how about fruit juices? Try to avoid them. But when I was still eating fruit juice, I would take 90% distilled water, really clean water, but tainted, put 5 or 10% fruit juice in. And after you do that a week or two, you're going to like it. The straight fruit juice is overwhelming for you. It just sort of hits you like this.
Sure. I know somebody who gave up all fruit and zucchini became like the sweetest thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You get away from it.
Yeah.
If you ever smoked a cigarette, you're the people who ate cigarettes the most. The same thing happens with sugar.
So my other question is about you say the hybridization of sugar.
Yeah.
So I've met people and some of them have old trees from like hundreds of years ago, maybe 100 years ago, and the fruit is pretty sweet. I mean, now they have a whole bunch of new mangoes out that are even sweeter than before. And I've spoken to these people about this question, and just know from growing and planting, if you plant a seed is not true to the fruit.
Yes.
So you could plant a mango seed, and it might come out very unsweet, but it might come out sweeter than the original. It's not going to be exact.
Exactly.
So what we've done today is we've selected all the sweet ones and left out the unsweet
Exactly
ones.
right.
But it wasn't man's intervention of that. It was man's doing that, but they didn't actually do anything to the fruit. They just selected the sweeter fruit.
Well, no, that's not quite exact. And with genetic modification, it's even worse today. You're going to see very soon for upper-class white people, if you go to an upper-class health store, you're going to have an A grade, a B grade, a C grade. That's what they're working on now. So the Chinese were the pioneers in this. Thousands of years ago, literally, they started to hybrid fruit. And the original hybridization is they take a branch off one tree and splice it together with straw with another tree, and it marries together. So it was a very neutral process. But you're right. They would actually pick the branch from the tree that produced the most fruit or the most plants or whatever it may be, the greenest of the trees, and that's how they made their orchard or their crop stronger. Now, but to say some fruit on a tree are sweeter than the other, that's understandable. Because the root system, and does it face the south? Does it face the north? Is it at the top of the tree? Is it at the bottom of the tree? All of these are factors that would make the sweetness. And sweetness comes from mineralization of the soil. That's really what it is. The more minerals you have in the soil, the sweeter a lettuce will become or a fruit will become. Now remember, all foods have glucose in them. So you need glucose. Let's not say you don't need glucose, you just don't need massive amounts of it. A 200-pound man, we did a study about 22 years ago where we showed a 200-pound muscular man required 2 medium-sized salads a day to get all the glucose he needs. You don't need anything beyond that. So what happens if you start to take high amounts of sugar and it pours into your bloodstream after a little bit burns up in your cell, which is an important factor, and now that's floating around, it's called blood sugar, and yes, it creates low blood sugar and high blood sugar, but more importantly, it feeds cancers, viruses, mold, yeast, and fungus.
So to my understanding and knowledge, the only fruits that are genetically modified are Hawaiian papayas and certain apples, genetically modified, laboratory-wise.
There's more today. That's the original ones. That was up until 3-4 years ago. Now
Okay.
grapes are doing grapes, and kiwi fruit, and there's 1 or 2 others.
But those sweeter fruits that are out there were more of a selection than when we say hybridized. Hybridized from nature. Everything's hybridized in nature with the pollen and the bees and everything else and what you're planting next to each other. But from a laboratory standpoint, the foods weren't, to my understanding and knowledge, weren't messed with like the papayas are today. What is the difference, in your opinion, between on the body between the fructose, and I'm not talking about orange juice, I'm talking about a whole fruit versus the glucose?
Well, number one, the body doesn't decipher the difference. If you look at the brilliant work of my colleague and friend, Thomas Seyfried, the most important man in history in cancer, he wrote the definitive book called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. They're after him constantly. He was at Yale, now he's at Boston College. He sat right here on the campus with me and explained why fruit sugar feeds cancer more than any sugar. So that's the one difference. But does diabetes care if it's fruit sugar or glucose?
I understand with disease, but in the way it's processed, does the glucose, the body...
So let's explain. Okay, I'll try not to be technical. So if you look at the way that your body breaks down sugars, the only sugar that breaks down like a fat in your body is fruit sugar, fructose. Now why that's a problem is that if you go back 100 years ago, we realized if you reduce oxygen inside of the human body to 30% less than it normally should be, you precipitate the growth of cancer, even in healthy people. So what is a fuel for cancer and viruses and bacteria and mold and yeast? It's sugar. So if you're reducing the oxygen, because all of these bad guys are anaerobic, meaning they don't like oxygen. You take away oxygen, viruses love it. Bacteria loves it. Mold loves it. You know that. Fungus loves it. So the fact is, you're reducing the oxygen. Now, I used to think when I was eating 50% of my diet as fruit, hey, this has got to be better because it's from a tree and it's nature and it's God, but you've heard that story. The truth of the matter is we didn't know that our bodies no longer, I'm not saying 1,000 years ago it didn't do it at 5,000, no longer have the ability to break it down and utilize it the way it should. Because I actually think a lot of us get more energy from fat than we do from sugar. And some of us basically should take more fat than we do sugar.
All right, there was that clip. Now, one of the things that Brian mentioned, and I remember him mentioning this for years, it was one of the first thing over 25 years when I first met him, he said, fruit today no longer is what it was years ago. He said specifically, an apple is 50 times sweeter today than it was 100 years ago. And when I used to hear that, I used to not have any reason not to believe his research. But now I grow fruit, and I recently was at a farm, and I go to a farm all the time, a mango farm. A mango is one of the sweetest fruits out there, and it's one of the highest fruits in fructose. So I was at a farm recently, and at that farm, it was a very windy day, but at that farm I spoke to the owner about mangoes, because there's a mango tree on that farm that's like 80 years old. And the fruit back then is just as sweet as the fruit today. So I discussed that with him, and here's that. All right, everybody, here we are with Alex from this farm, Tropical Acres Farms. And how many mango trees do you have here on this farm?
Total, it's got to be more than 800.
And
I haven't counted in a while, but it's somewhere between 800 and 1,000.
how many years have you been studying mangoes?
Well, I mean, as a career, I started doing it in 2011 officially, but I started studying them well before that. So, I guess I've been studying them in one way or another for like about 17 years or something like that. Maybe it's more like 15 years. I don't know. It's in that range.
And we're in front of this big mango tree, and there's a whole bunch of other smaller, newer mango trees here. But this mango tree, look at this trunk. How old is this mango tree on this farm?
The stock that it was grafted to, I'm sure would have been planted like in the 40s or something like that. So the stump is 70 plus years old. It could be older than that. The graft is 60 something years old in that case. So.
Okay, so 60 to 70-year-old is this tree, and you said you had some even older on this farm. How old are your oldest trees
The
here?
oldest trees here are over 100. We have a Mulgoba mango that's well over 100. I imagine it was grafted around either the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th. And then we have a turpentine tree that's almost certainly from the 19th century. So
Okay,
over 100.
there
Over
are
120 years old.
there are some people that are under the impression that, and sorry for the wind, everybody, but here it is, and here we are. There are some people under the impression that somehow fruit, sweet fruit, like mangoes, one of the sweeter fruit, has been tampered with by man to make them sweeter. From your knowledge, is that true at all?
Well, I mean, we've selected varieties over time, you know, just from normal cultivation. It's normal for us to select a variety, a seedling or whatever that is of exceptional quality and, you know, propagate it. Whether mango fruit in general have become sweeter, it's harder to say, you know, but because there's so many varieties. So, I mean, some of the varieties that have come out in recent years are pretty sweet. You know, you'd have to kind of Brix test them and evaluate them on an individual basis to say if their, you know, if their sugar content is higher. But
So when you say Brix, what does that mean exactly?
Brix is the measurement of the total soluble solids, which is usually sugar content, whether it's fruit or, you know, vegetables or what have you.
So what's some of the highest mangoes Brix right now in the score?
The highest that we've recorded here in Florida is in the 20s, specifically like the mid-20s to, I think maybe the highest that we found is like 27 in that range. California, they can get a little higher than that. They can apparently hit the low 30s. Some varieties can, depending on the weather conditions. But here in Florida, if you're in the 20s, you're doing pretty well. So,
Now, was it possible that 100 years ago or even beyond that, that there was fruit at that high?
oh yeah, absolutely possible, and probable, I would say. the difference between now and then is that we've developed, named cultivars and stuff like that, whereas back then many mangoes were just chance seedlings and there weren't as many grafted trees. But I'm sure amongst those chance seedlings there was some pretty amazing stuff, some of which got propagated. I mean, there's real old mango varieties that are still around that are of terrific eating quality and very sweet, that are 100 plus years old. And, a lot of those have stood the test of time.
So from your knowledge, fruit isn't necessarily any sweeter today than it was back in the older days.
Generally speaking, I mean, maybe not, but I mean, there's certainly more varieties available to us now than there were back then that have names and stuff like that. So I can't imagine how many different mangoes have been planted at some point in time in the Indian subcontinent, for example. It has to be an incredible number, and I'm sure there's stuff that, from way back in the day that was mind-blowing and can't find it because it never got propagated. So yeah, from the perspective of selecting varieties that are better quality, a lot of times they will be sweeter. So in that sense, what's being grown, for instance, we used to have a lot of Hayden mangoes in Florida. We still do. But the varieties that have been bred since the Hayden, generally speaking, have been sweeter than the Hayden. The Hayden has an average brick score probably in the mid-teens to upper teens, but doesn't usually break 20. A lot of the newer hybrids can break 20, so certainly they've been selected in part because they're sweeter, in part because they have more interesting flavors or better horticultural characteristics, disease resistance, growth habit, things like that. So, I guess you could say that in some respects, fruit have gotten sweeter, but it's hard for me to say that if we took a survey of mangoes in the year 1905 and random trees, for instance, and then did the same thing today, I don't know what the difference would look like. You'd have to do that on some kind of scientific scale. I think that's hard to quantify.
I think one issue also would be is our taste buds are so weakened now, and we have such a sugar addiction over the last 100 years that even like a Hayden mango back then that tasted real sweet probably tastes very bland to people today.
Yeah, there's certainly some of that. I mean, there are people who just love mangoes and they'll take any kind of mango, and then there are people who seek out very specific kinds of mangoes, especially newer ones. And for those people, something like a Hayden or some other old school variety isn't really enough, and they, in some cases, rather have no mangoes than have those mangoes.
Sure.
Which, that's not my perspective, but that's certainly a lot of theirs, and so there is some of that. So.
When people say that fruit is hybridized, what exactly does that mean in your opinion?
Well, it means that you had two parents and you produced an offspring, from those two parents that took on qualities of either one, maybe more from one than the other, or maybe something very specific that was hopefully you're trying to achieve out of it. With mangoes, for instance, that might be that you're trying to get a larger fruit. Maybe you're trying to get something more disease resistant, or something with firm flesh, or something with a unique flavor. Like we have coconut and citrus flavored mangoes and stuff like that now. So that was definitely a goal of Gary Zill's hybridization program. And, with David Sturrock's program that was done here, a big goal was disease resistance, resistance to anthracnose and powdery mildew. And so he hybridized with the Philippine mango to get better disease resistance because it had really terrific disease resistance. So his hybrids generally have pretty good resistance to fungi.
But in nature, all fruits are naturally hybridized, right?
Sure. I mean, not all are hybrids. Anything that's asexually produced is a clone of the parent, so it's not a hybrid. But those that are sexually produced are hybrids because they have two parents.
But so man hasn't done anything, to your knowledge, to mangoes that can't be done naturally, right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we haven't done genetic modification to mangoes. That has not occurred yet. not to say that it won't eventually happen. It probably will eventually happen. But the mango genome hasn't been as well studied in the time that they've done genetic studies and analysis compared to other crops, whether they're fruit crops or row crops, vegetable crops. Because in Western countries, developed countries, mango has not occupied a major niche in terms of importance in the scale of what's being grown. We know a lot more about soybeans and corn genetics than we do about mangoes, but in recent years they've made quite a bit of study on mango genetics. So I suppose eventually they'll get to that point.
All right, I'm going to put your website below the video. Thank you so much for sharing that information.
Yeah.
Now, in my research after going to that farm, I also went down to speak to a fruit grower, a fellow Julian Laura, who has Laura Farms in South Homestead, Florida. An amazing farm. His father's second generation fruit growing farm, and they grow a lot of sweet tropical fruit there. So I was talking to him about is fruit the same today as it was back then, and here's what he had to say about that. There's this place, this health institute, and they talk about the sugar in fruit, and the guy says fruit isn't what it once was. An apple is like 50 times sweeter now than it was 100 years ago. But I was at Alex, and he had fruit trees that are 100 years old and are fruit super sweet. So did they hybridize these to make them sweeter, or is it just a good variety came up?
Just a good variety. And like, for example, a banana. When you buy a banana and it's a yellow banana, that has a certain amount of sugar. Now, if you let the banana ripen more and it gets black spots on it, the sugar level is going to be even higher than it was originally when you got it. So it all depends on when you eat it. If you eat it early, if you eat it really ripe, or whatnot. Now, as far as glucose, I'm not afraid of glucose.
Fructose.
Oh, fructose. I'm not afraid of fructose. I mean, the LDL and the HDL, when it reacts to fruits, it can handle it. Now, what happens if you mix that with refined sugar and breads and pasta and have fructose from the fruits and all that stuff, and then meats and all that stuff, that's a bad combination. Basically, I like an animal diet, animal meat, organs, like liver. These are like
completely
the most
opposite to the way I eat, basically.
right, kind of, because that's the most sought after foods in human evolution. I mean, 10,000 years ago, think about what the human diet was. It was animals and fruit. You bring a papaya back to the village, back to the tribe, is going to cause celebration and like happiness, just from the colors and bright. That's the part of the tree that wants to be eaten.
But sweet fruits like mangoes and jackfruits, like when you get a really sweet variety, has that just naturally always been as sweet, or do you think man intervention did something?
Man's intervention has been more on the side of vegetables. We didn't have vegetables, let's say, 2,000 years ago. We didn't have carrots, we didn't have potatoes, we didn't have bell peppers, we didn't have lettuce. It's a brand new thing made by man. So leaves, stems, roots, seeds, that's the part of the plant that does not want to be eaten. The part of the plant that wants to be eaten is the fruit. And it makes it sweet, it makes it colorful, it makes it bright, attractive, and tastes good, and to make you want to eat it and plant the seed. That's the purpose of the tree is catering to us. It recognizes
What about
us.
seedless fruits and combined fruits, hybridized fruits, like taking a plum and they call it a pluot. You take a plum and an apricot and mix them together. Is that man intervention?
Well, just like Atamoya. Atamoya is a man intervention. It's a hybrid between sugar apple and the South American cherimoya. And the whole purpose behind that was to be able to have something similar to South American cherimoya in the tropics. So man intervened in that in order to have something similar to cherimoya. Watermelon, seedless watermelon. Let me tell you, there's women that are seedless that can't have kids, and that's true in nature also. You have seedless.
A commercialization of it. I think they did the watermelon just because people don't want to chew the seeds.
Yeah. Well, they came across a seedless watermelon. Maybe they planted thousands of seeds to come across a seedless watermelon, just like my dad helped introduce the Ruby Supreme 1030, which was the 1,000 and 30th seed that was evaluated.
Wow.
And it came out to be resistant to the worms. So, and that was a hybrid between the ruby guava and the supreme guava. So, and they planted seeds of that hybrid. A guava has like 100 seeds inside of it. So they planted thousands of seeds, and out of thousands, they came up with the 629, which is the larger version and gets worms, and the 1030, which is the smaller one, but it's resistant to worms.
I was in Malaysia years ago, and all these monkeys were eating bananas, and they said, "Well, the humans don't like those bananas because there's seeds in there," and it was actually seeds in the bananas, like papaya seeds.
Yes.
Do you think they were hybridized over the years to be seedless?
No,
or they just...
original bananas had seeds.
Yeah. So what happened? Was it man intuition? Probably?
Hybridizing, probably. The bananas that we eat at the supermarket, it's a very fine, pleasant banana. It's not a perfect size. It's just a special banana that could become extinct because out of, let's say, thousands and thousands of bananas, one of them has a seed in there, and they go through thousands of bananas every year, maybe even tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bananas every year, just to find that seed again, to be able to plant it. I saw a whole documentary about it.
So do you think all seedless fruit is hybridized to a degree, or not necessarily?
Well, we're all hybrids.
Yeah.
We're all hybrids.
I mean, man intervention, though.
Well, like an Adamoya, where they hybridize. Well, that happens in nature too. That's what we got. Tangors and tangelos and grapefruits, and navel oranges. All those are hybrids. In Cuba, we have a hybrid that's totally natural. It's native to Cuba. It's the white orange, and I suspect it's a hybrid between the native grapefruit, the native white grapefruit that we have over there, and a tangerine. So it happens naturally. When man intervenes and does their own hybrids, they do it, to make it more resistant to a virus, to make it more resistant to this or that.
But also sweeter and seedless, so they could sell it more too, probably.
Yeah. You gotta have reward.
Yeah. But also there must be some drawbacks too in terms of, hey, fruit is sweet, but never meant to be like seeds. I'm sure cut down on the.
Well, I would take a watermelon with seeds any day.
Yeah,
I'll take a watermelon
absolutely,
because genetically it's more pure, But it's a deficient gene that it makes it seedless. I mean, I'm talking like a scientist. I'm not a scientist, but it's a deficient seed. Well, it's like a woman who can't have kids.
Yeah.
They can't have kids. Just a watermelon that can't have seeds. It's like a sugar apple that doesn't have seeds. I have one. So there's a human version in plants. There's dwarf plants. There's plants that are super tall, big. Some that are more susceptible to disease. Some that are resistant to disease.
Now that definitely humans are making some, like the Hawaiian papaya is GMO. It's one of the few fruits that are actually genetically modified, and now they're genetically modifying apples to make them more disease resistant, but at our poor health because it's bad for us.
Yeah. Well, they have to take it to the lab and measure all the pros and cons.
Yeah.
With
but mangoes and like figs and all these foods that were named in the Bible, let's say, do you think if you got a good variety, they're just as sweet as they were today as they were back then, or do you think they're sweeter today?
Look, the most common custard apple is the yellow skin. It's the most common custard apple. We've been introduced to new varieties like the red skin with red flesh inside, like the Fernandez and the San Pablo. Okay, those have always existed, but they've been hidden in the rainforest in Brazil, and it hasn't been introduced until the early 2000s, late 90s, by Gary Zill. So are they sweeter? And I think the original one is even sweeter than the red ones. The original yellow skin, I think they have more of a pleasant, mild, not as rich and strong as the red ones. But there's pros and cons and everything.
So I go to Alex's farm and he has Edward trees that are hundreds of years old, and they have sweet fruit on them. Right. And when people tell me, "Oh, fruit has been made to make sweeter today," I'm like, "Well, it was sweet back then."
It was sweet back then too. The original custard apple, I think is a lot sweeter than the red ones. Not a lot sweeter, just a different flavor, more.
Now, that was that clip. Now, to further look at this topic, there's a place in Homestead. It's a tropical research center connected to the University of Florida, and I went to go visit Dr. Jonathan Crane, who runs this place. And this is 100 acres of tropical fruit trees that they're doing experiments on and everything else. And I wanted to just make sure that I was correct in my understanding from my own personal experience that fruit my opinion is has fruit changed is the fruit isn't any sweeter today than it was years ago. What's happening is the selection of the fruit that we're marketing is the sweeter varieties. So it's more available to us. So the sweeter fruit is more available to us today. So in other words, before we hear from Jonathan, I'll explain. So if I grow a mango from a seed, chances are it might come up very sweet and delicious, but chances are it's going to come out not sweet and delicious. They're not true to seed. Most fruits aren't. So the only way we're going to know is we're going to do it. So years ago, when people planted mangoes in their backyard and so on, if they got a sweet tree, wonderful. If they didn't, too bad. Well, what happened is we learned how to graft, and Brian Clement was talking about this earlier. And grafting is when you could take a part of that tree that's really sweet and put it on that tree that's not so sweet. So all the future fruit on that tree is going to be sweet. So over time, as this has happened, now those sweet varieties are more available to us. If somebody wants to say that taking that graft and putting on a new tree is man intervention, you can say that, but technically it's maybe it is technically, maybe it's not, but it's not a bad thing. It's just giving us a better variety, and it's not only to make sweeter food, but also sometimes disease-resistant food. It's almost like a natural, healthy form of the GMO, which is very unhealthy. Many people are confused. They think GMO and hybridization are the same thing, but they're not. Hybridization could happen in nature naturally without man intervention. It can happen with man-made pollination and so on. But it's nowhere near as harmful and as bad as a genetically modified food, which is really bad. Genetically modified food is extremely harmful to us. Now, many people don't understand that. First of all, if the food's organic, it can never be genetically modified, because as for now, in 2022, if it's organic, it's not GMO. This food is not technically officially organic by certification, but I grew it. I know it's organic. So that's one thing. Another thing is GMO and hybridization are two different things. And there's only a few fruits in nature that are actually genetically modified as of now. Now, in the future, I could see that being more. But right now, like the Hawaiian papaya is one of them, because it was a beetle that was getting in there. So they started genetically modifying it so that wouldn't be an issue any longer. Maybe there were at some point some potatoes. I don't know if they still are. That's more of a vegetable. But there are at one time tomatoes, I believe, were, but they stopped doing that. Point being is not many fruits are genetically modified. Now, unorganic, sprayed with pesticides, hybridized, sometimes with the good intentions but bad results. So, yeah, it might be an issue, but these are just things I want to discuss. So here's Jonathan Crane from Trek and the Research Center, and here's what he had to say about the audience.
Hi, how you doing? I'm with the University of Florida, and this is the Tropical Research and Education Center in Homestead.
Okay, how big's the property?
We have 160 acres. The station started in 1929. We now have 18 faculty, entomologists, plant pathologists, ag economists, hydrologists, a biogeochemist, an agroecologist, soil scientists, very broad field number of disciplines.
And when we look at hybridization of the different fruits, is that man-made or does that happen natural or both?
Okay, both. So an Adamoya is a hybrid between Annona cherimoya, which is cherimoya, and sugar apple, Annona squamosa. And there are natural hybrids, but the first recorded man-made hybrids were actually made in Miami, years ago. Since then, they've been made in many places around the world. But it does happen naturally. But the Adamoyas we have here, one is called Gefner. This is actually a selection that was made in Israel many years ago.
So fruit-wise, though, I was just telling you about the fruit diet I'm on.
Yes.
One of the people that run up there at Hippocrates, they're against too much sugar and fructose, and they said fruit is 100 times sweeter today than it was, or 50 times sweeter today than it was years ago. but because of man hybridization, they've created to be sweeter today. But I was at Alex's, and he has a Edward tree that's 100 years old, and the fruit tastes very sweet.
Right.
So mangoes and things like that, man-made hybrids that are so sweet, or are they just naturally that sweet?
Okay, so when if you're talking about a breeding program to improve the sweetness of fruits, that is true that there can be purposeful breeding programs to make mangoes sweeter, to make cherries sweeter, whatever. I would say most of the time though, but it's just natural. I mean, it's not like they're. I don't know anybody inserting genes into the genome of mangoes to make them sweeter. What they're doing is they're making crosses between different varieties, growing them out, and then selecting the ones that are sweet. So they're naturally, that's as sweet as they are. And there's some limits, there's some genetic limits. In other words, somewhere between a range, as an example with papaya, the range is gonna be somewhere between 4 and maybe 18 degree bricks, right? So there's this range. You're not going to go to 25. You're not going to go to 30.
So they can't go out of their
right. There's a
range.
genetic limit. Yes.
So the fruits that were mentioned in the Bible, the fig and the apple, or whatever else was around back then, could they have been just as sweet as then as they are today, possibly? Or?
I would say there probably were. They were seedling trees. So the variation in their sweetness was probably gigantic, from bitter to sweet, right? And so what happens is over time, just inhabitants of whatever area, if you're talking about apples, the inhabitants where apples are indigenous to, or if you're talking about sugar apples, you're talking about Mexico, Central America, over time, people would identify trees, I'm talking about indigenous people, wherever they are. It doesn't have to be in the tropics, it could be in the subtropics or temperate zone, would identify trees. Oh man, this apple tree is much sweeter than that one down the road. So they would take the seeds from that, eat the fruit, and plant those seeds. And so over time, it was a selection program, but it was, very long-term, very slow. It was purposeful, but, very long timelines. And so over time, yeah, they would be sweeter than the original apple that they perhaps saw.
Sweeter, or they were just more available?
Both, actually, more available, bigger. A lot of times they looked at the size of the fruit, but also the sweetness. Those are probably the two main things that people looked at first, or selected for. And they weren't necessarily consciously selecting for, but I would say probably were selecting consciously at the same time. This one's, like I said, that tree over there, that one is sweet. And the fruit's big.
But it was just a natural seedling, most likely, not man-made.
Not man-made.
Now, as for genetically modified, I know the Hawaiian papaya is genetically modified, and I think they were talking about some apples in the future being modified. Are they modified yet, or you don't know?
I don't know about
okay.
The temperate zone crops. I really don't know about. I work, with.
But besides Hawaiian papaya, do you know any other tropical fruits that are genetically modified?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No.
All right. Okay. So show us the. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay. Now, with all that information in and all those people talking about this, the question still comes down to, is fructose bad for our bodies? Is it the same as glucose and other types of sugars? And I've been eating a raw vegan diet for a long time, and my opinion of this is there's a big difference between high fructose corn syrup, which many studies on fructose are done, or the fructose found in a whole fruit with its skin and with the fruit and everything and the seeds, a big difference, because the whole fruit eaten together, it contains the fiber and the phytonutrients along with the fructose. So it's slowing down the rate of the fructose getting in the system, and it's also giving your body all the nutrients and the phytonutrients at the same time. So fructose in fruit is not the same as high fructose corn syrup in the body. And I would think this is a very healthy food. If you're eating an overall healthy diet, there's nothing wrong with eating some fruit. Now, if you're not eating a healthy diet, if you're eating a diet of a lot of sugar already, and then you start eating a lot of dried fruit and things like that, might not be the best. So you'd want to limit the sugar on every level, and that includes fructose. Most people aren't eating a healthy diet. They're eating a lot of processed food, a lot of processed sugar, and somebody that has like type 2 diabetes, they're already eating a lot of processed sugar, and so on. If they add fructose to their diet, it's not necessarily doing them a good benefit, especially if they add it in the form of high fluorescent or high fructose corn syrup or something like that. Now, what some people do in the health movement, just in general, they'll take the juice out of many of the fruits. Like, for example, orange juice. Orange juice, in my opinion, is not healthy unless it's diluted. I think any fruit juice needs to be diluted with at least 50-50 water, but possibly even more, because what you're doing is you're taking the fiber nutrients, everything else out, and now you're making that fructose almost, or not, just more closer to high fructose corn syrup. It's still not exactly the same, but you're making it closer. So, and that goes for any liquid sweetener as well, not just necessarily fructose. You need to be careful if you're juicing this. Now, a lot of the processed fruit juices on the market make it even worse, because they literally cook and steam out all the nutrients and everything else. But even if you're making fresh orange juice at home in your own orange juicer, I do think it's beneficial to dilute the juice, maybe even more than just 50-50. But the best way to have fruit is whole. And I do believe in food combining. I think it's helpful not to eat fats with sugars at the same time. I have another person I interviewed, Dr. Frank Sabatino, who's a brilliant man and has been eating a healthy diet for many, many years. And I asked him this question about fruit. Is fruit healthy for the body? And here's what he had to say about it. And today's guest is Dr. Frank Sabatino. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Thank
How
you,
are
Paul.
you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So next I want to talk about is fruit, because you mentioned fruit. What about fructose? Because we hear about so much negative stuff. Even Brian Clement and Hippocrates and other people talk about fructose because...
Well, see, the thing that came down is that we know, for example, that cancer cells have a predilection for sugar. That's what helps them function the best. They require huge amounts of sugar for their metabolism and for their life, basically. So the mentality was that if you're loading the system up on these foods that are providing high levels of sugar intake, in a way you're favoring the growth and stability of cancer tissue. The problem is that when you look at fructose in foods that have high fiber and high water content, the absorption of that is definitely much more controlled. And especially if you're eating this way, your overall insulin function is pretty stable. And so I don't find that to be as big an issue. But if I'm going to do fruits and things with cancer patients or people of that nature, I may still opt for lower glycemic fruits. I'll do more berries and things of those kinds of foods. But the truth is, I think fruit has been given a bad name. And if you can get local, organically grown fruit, let's face it, it's probably the most fit food for primates. So fruits and greens to me are really where it's at as far as food.
One of the things I find with fruit is like, unlike glucose and grains, it doesn't give your body that signal of like you're full, because you could just eat so much of it, where your grains you can get full from, but it bypasses that and goes right to the liver, and it just doesn't give you that signal to say I'm full. So, I mean, do you limit fruit or unlimited amounts? Because I know some raw food is that.
No, because you know what? After doing this as long as I am, I'll eat a certain amount of fruit, and I'll have a sense of fullness. I just pay attention to that, because you could always go past that. And the truth of the matter is, when you simplify the number of items at a meal, it's kind of intriguing. Like if you ate monotropically, and I said to you, go eat as many potatoes as you want. I mean, you'd eat a few potatoes and you'd stop. You know, we wind up, when you start varying number of items, it's funny how you lose that feedback information. But when you simplify, you have much better sense of stop points. So, you know, if I'm eating fruit, like today, I have these beautiful organic sumo oranges and some pink grapefruit and some pineapple. So, you know, I'll make a nice plate of that. I eat it slowly, and when that's done, I'm feeling pretty good, you know, and so I stop. But I don't see that as being a big problem. But I oftentimes will have people eat a little bit of celery, cucumber, romaine lettuce with fruit, especially for people that have had sugar issues with diabetes and things of that nature. And I find that also provides another level of stability in their intake.
somebody told me that fruit is like 50 times sweeter today than it was 100 years ago. But I have a friend here who has a farm that has 100-year-old mango trees, and they're just as sweet now as they were years ago.
Yes, I don't. I think that's a bit of a bogus argument. I think the best thing is to try to get the best organically grown stuff as local to where you are as you can get, and I think that's going to still build in a little bit of protection. And I find that fruit is one of God's greatest gifts on the planet. Let's face it. I mean, nobody picks a mango from a tree and worries about how they're going to saute it, steam it, or cook it, because in its natural state, it's most natural for us. So, when you get to this mentality that you're going to cut out fruit completely out of your diet, I think it's a huge mistake.
Okay, so there's some, reports or studies that saying the fruit will come really hard on the body, even if it's in the form of fructose. Ultimately, the best way is to experiment on yourself. I do believe in people doing blood work and checking out what they're doing to make sure it's working for them. If you are eating a fruit diet or a high fruit diet or any fruit in your diet, and you could experiment in your blood work if things are working out for you, great. I tell everybody ultimately do what's working for you. So if you're not getting disease, you don't have symptoms, and your blood work's okay, there's no problem most likely with the current diet you're eating. But if you are seeing some issues, then you want to try to find ways to improve it. And maybe cutting back on fruit would be something to experiment with for certain people. But we also have to take into account the addiction to sugar. And even though it's fructose and it's in a form of a healthy form, if it's eaten in a whole fruit, sugar is an addicting substance. And if we want to cut back, especially if we're trying to cut back from processed sugar, and we're doing it for a fructose, it might not help us get rid of that addiction. I know people that went on a very low sugar or no sugar diet and only eating low sugar fruits like berries and so on, and they could no longer enjoy the taste of high sugar fruits. So that might be a good thing. Maybe they've helped themselves get over the sugar addiction. I know for myself, I used to drink a lot of soda when I was a little kid. And then one time I went like a whole couple of weeks without soda trying to cut the habit. And then when I tried to drink a can after that, I couldn't do it. It was too sweet, and I never touched another soda again. Now, another thing to take into account to think about with fruit is most fruit today is not picked fresh from a tree like I pick it. Most fruit today comes from the supermarket, and the supermarket gets that fruit from somewhere around the world. And to ship it, they cannot pick the fruit ripe off the tree. So if the fruit is not picked at the right time, not only will it develop all the nutrients and phytochemicals and phytonutrients and everything else it needs, it's just not going to digest well. It's going to be more acidic. And ideally, I believe if you can't get fruit fresh, ripe off the tree, probably better not to eat it. After being a grower of fresh fruit and eating it ripe off the tree myself, I've come to the conclusion, it's probably best not to eat things that are picked unripe, unless, like an avocado, they ripen off the tree naturally. And technically, every fruit ripens off the tree, so it's not the worst habit. But for example, I got some bananas growing up there, and if they're green and I take them down before they turn yellow, they will ripen, but it wouldn't be the same as if they ripen on the tree. And I do believe our Creator designed fruit to be picked from the tree. And some people say, well, they can't do that. They can't just pick fruit right off the tree because it doesn't grow where they live or in their environment. Which leads me to another question. It's eating for our environment or eating where we live. So, there are some people that are under the belief that, we should eat locally grown foods, which I strongly believe in as well. But if you're eating in your environment, and you're living up north, you'll never be able to eat a banana or some of these other tropical fruits because they just don't grow there. And I'm not completely against it, environmental eating. A lot of times what people do is they create a tropical environment in their house, even if it's 0 degrees outside. It's like 80 degrees in their house with their heaters and everything else. But that fruit had to travel to get to you. And it's not locally grown. And technically, it is cold outside, so probably not in line with what you're eating as for eating during seasonal foods. For example, if Eskimos are in an igloo in Alaska eating watermelon, they're not going to do as well as if somebody's in the tropics on a beach eating a watermelon. The same thing if Eskimos are eating their whale blubber that they eat and all their fat in their cold environment. If somebody in the tropics tries to eat that, it's not going to do as well for them. So there is something to say about eating best for the environment you're in. Absolutely. So that's another thing to consider. Overall, I think eating locally and seasonally to the best of our ability is a wise thing. I do believe eating fruit in its whole form is okay, but I do believe we have to be careful with the sugar addiction, and I'm a big advocate against overeating no matter what food we're eating. And one of the foods people overeat on the most is sugar. And I'm not a fan of dried fruit. I'm not a fan of liquid fruit in a juicing form. I'm a fan of whole fresh fruit. Now, if you're having a very bitter green vegetable juice and you want to put an apple in there to sweeten it up, I'm okay with that. You're diluting it. You're diluting it not only with water, but you're diluting it with a lot of other nutrients and things like that. So that's okay and okay to do. Remember, fat and sugar are two of the things that get us into trouble if we do too much of them. It's very difficult to do too much green leafy vegetables or vegetables in general. But the fruits and fats we can get ourselves in trouble with. So you just got to show extra caution when it comes to that. There's a lot of myths and ideas about sugar, and but ultimately your body has to be its own experiment. Some people might react different. We got to look environmental and some other things. But if you can grow your own fruit and not overeat, it's a wonderful blessing for us and the food for man, as it says in the scriptures. All right. So everybody, put your comments and questions below what your feedback or your idea is of sugar. I hope this was informative for you. And like as for the idea of is fruit sweeter today than it once was, I've eaten fruit from trees that are 80 years old and they're very sweet. So I don't know if during the biblical times, I can only imagine they were sweeter and more delicious. But our craving or our taste buds weren't as denatured as they are today. So who knows? Until then, everybody, put your comments, questions below. Have a great day and a great real life.
Nature's wealth, good for your health. This is the Raw Life Health Show. Raw Life, brighten up your life.